we have in South Africa today 50.6% of our households receiving social welfare. This is unique in the world, where you have more than half of your household in your country receiving welfare. So,
guys, shocking facts. Back-to-back facts by one of my really popular, really excellent, and well-followed analysts in South Africa, Mbeki, arguing that as much as 60% of South African households are on welfare. In other words, when you calculate all the families or households in South Africa, 60% of them are on SASSA. It's shocking. Now, I don't know if this is true, but we'll begin this video here with this comment by, I found on my channel here that said, "Good morning, sir, and all the guests here. I've heard that there is a man in South Africa that has 8 wives with kids living in Zimbabwe and a wife here in South Africa with children. Their total SASSA per month is almost 43,000 rand. They come over and collect and go back. How on earth did this happen? Mr. Mackenzie, you have my support, that's for sure. Please run for president because Mr. Ramaphosa is an absent president. He does not care about what's going on in this country. God bless you all." So this is a comment right here on the channel. You can actually go back. I think it's under the video where I made the post where Gaten Mackenzie's was arguing that the families on SASSA in South Africa, or the population of South Africa in SASSA. And in this video now, you could hear Mbeki breaking down, the facts on how the ANC's policies, might have caused this whole disaster with SASSA. And although SASSA was supposedly a good policy, so to speak, to help the poor South Africans, so to speak, but it has degenerated into something that is really difficult to understand at the moment, and to the point where there are 60% of South African households that are on SASSA. For me, it's not surprising anyway. There are many African households in Africa which also are struggling to survive, all right? But in South Africa's case, because of this whole welfare provision, the fact that, like Gaten Mackenzie complains, there's this lack of ability to dream anymore. SASSA seems to take away that ability to dream, and it actually has the capacity to make people dependent on this 350 rand from SASSA. And now Mbeki points out that 60%, for me it's really surprising and also intriguing at the same time, that 60% of South African households are on SASSA. Let's quickly listen to him break down this argument, and I'll be back for a really interesting analysis.
So how does the ANC then change the structures of our economy, and radically so, because time has also passed where the majority of people in this country sometimes feel, but we're not participating in the economy in our majority, but also we don't just want to be participants in the economy, we want to be owners of this economy. So what are the policies, in your view, that can bring about that kind of transformation?
well, that's not, you said the ANC's thinking is not what you're saying. The ANC is more interested in building an African or a black middle class using the state, employment in the state. So what has happened, one of the key policies of the ANC is to build this hugely bloated public service, which is very highly paid, but actually not very competent, which has led to the problems we have in municipalities, to the problems that the country has with the state-owned enterprises, the problems of Transnet, of South African Airways. Those are the ANC's policies. And I think those policies are going to continue because the DA has not contested those policies. It has accepted those policies.
What does that mean then for ordinary South Africans who have been waiting for change? There are a majority of people in this country that are still living in poverty. We are among the countries with the highest levels of inequality. So If you're talking about policies that have been around that have not really changed much when it comes to ordinary South Africans, what hope should ordinary South Africans have, even in this GNU, that their lives are going to fundamentally change?
Look, nothing is going to change because in the statement of intent, there is no intention to change the existing policies. So the poor, we have in South Africa today 50.6% of our households receiving social welfare. This is unique in the world, where you have more than half of your household in your country receiving welfare. So this shows there is nothing in the agreement of the Government of National Unity that says they are going to adopt policies that will change this.
And the ANC, of course, sometimes it appears as though they take pride in the fact that there are so many people that depend on their government for social welfare, when in fact they should be just diversifying and ensuring that people are independent and they've got jobs. But then some in the ANC will argue that, well, if you look at our context and where the country comes from, of course, there will be lots of people that didn't have the same opportunities that their majority white counterparts had in this country. And now those people have been left with really not much. And that's why the ANC has really have to pick them up from the ground and try assist where it can.
Yeah, but those are excuses. The ANC has been in power for 30 years. 30 years is what is called a generation in a society. If in 30 years you haven't been able to change, to make a significant change to the structure of the economy, then you have failed. And the voters have decided that the ANC has failed. So that's why.
What's their excuse? Why do you think they failed? I mean, they've got the levers of power. Why couldn't they fundamentally change the lives of ordinary South Africans? And I'm not talking about some of the global challenges that have really become a challenge to any country, like COVID-19, for instance. But you talk about 30 years. That was ample opportunity for the organization. Where do you think the weaknesses were?
Well, there were many, many weaknesses. First, there was a book written by one of the leaders of the ANC, a gentleman called Dr. Kulumbata. This was published, and he used to be advisor to President Ramaphosa. He wrote a book called Unmasked, Why the ANC Failed to Govern. And he went to exile in 1977. And he was looked after the ANC until he came back, and he worked for the ANC. And he listed why the ANC was not prepared and was not preparing itself to govern the country.
But the ANC had that document. What do they call it? Ready to govern.
Yes,
Isn't that the document that was meant to prepare them for government?
The easiest thing under the sun for a political party is to write a document. It is the doing that is important.
I mean, they also have a document through the eye of the needle, which is supposed to be used to judge the kind of leaders that the ANC elects. But you look at the leaders they've elected over the years and you wonder where that eye of the needle document has been. So what do you think then of the GNU? Can it be sustainable over the next 5 years? And what are the chances that the so-called progressive parties may actually come together and challenge this kind of government in 2029?
Well, I think the GNU is going to survive for the coming 5 years because, as I point out, the DA has no quarrel with the ANC's policies. It hasn't said it disagrees with the A. We have this hugely bloated civil service. The DA hasn't said the civil service must be reduced. It hasn't said black economic empowerment must be reduced. So the policies that the ANC has been running are going to be the same policies, which means that the welfare of the population will stagnate and decline as it has been declining for the last 12, 15 15 years. So I don't expect any change there.
Yeah,
And what-
brilliant. This whole thing with welfare, I've gone across Europe and the Western countries, at least the few I've visited, and I know that the whole thing with welfare, the welfare state and all that, it's a thing. And usually most of these countries, especially in Europe, especially the Nordic states anyway, they usually operate what South Africans call SASSA today, as something that is supposed to be a stepping stone. So in other words, when someone loses their job, they do not degenerate totally. There's a base for them to survive before they get into the next job. So this is actually how the welfare works. But the welfare also supports people who are refugees, who come into these nations as refugees, and then also asylum seekers, and props them until they get on their feet. Before they now eventually get a job and get assimilated into the nation and all that. And it appears that this is what I'm seeing, is happening in South Africa. But in South Africa, I think the case is really, because when I read your comments, I really understand that it appears that most of the people who actually also get SASSA are also not legal, living illegally in the country. In this kind of states, in the Nordic states, for example, in Sweden, Finland, and these other states, there's no way you can be illegal and receive SASSA or welfare, so to speak. So you have to be, so there's a tag on the people who receive that support, all right? And if at the end of the day you do not meet certain requirements, you're deported back to your country. But in South Africa, it's really strange. And now this whole issue with the fact that there's 60% of South African households, the statistics show that. I really don't know if probably these households now involve the counting of those who actually are counted as the illegal foreigners and have those parts of the households also counted in this. But also, I think I want to ponder also on this argument by Mosleko, a really interesting comment, because it actually opens the floor to really talk about a lot of the things we've been talking about on this channel. So this person says, illegal immigrants in South Africa present our country with 3 major headaches that I hope you can cover in your future videos. Being undocumented means that their presence in our country is unknown, and this presents them with opportunities to engage in illegal activities. That's for sure. We know that, because the problem now with the digitalization that Leon Scriber is trying to implement in Home Affairs, I think it will go a long way in hoping to curb this whole problem with illegal foreigners in South Africa, but also the porosity of the borders. I actually was listening to a video report the other day that actually argued that, when trying to chase back these illegal foreigners back, they jump into the Limpopo River, and at the end of the day, it appears that there's a certain jurisdiction or kind of like a law that says that, whoever is in the river, so to speak, there aren't laws that govern the pursuit of this kind of people or excavation of people as long as they cross that river, because the river is not sort of like a recognized polity or space that is geographically bounded by law, so to speak. So at the end of the day, when they jump into the river or probably stay in the river, so to speak, they are not it's difficult to handle that space as, a basis to argue that these guys are illegal foreigners or something like that. So the Limpopo River in itself, has kind of like the need for laws that govern how immigration illegally takes place, along that border of South Africa. So it's a thing that's really clear that, being undocumented is actually a really big problem. And this is what Dumaboko in Botswana is trying to do with the Zimbabweans in Botswana. He's arguing that rather than deport these Zimbabweans, he wants to try to make them legal. In other words, he wants to legalize the illegal Zimbabweans in South Africa. And then his argument anyway in Botswana is that when they are now legal, now they can compete for jobs. And at the end of the day, it would actually dissuade employers who actually use them and pay them less to now start hunting for really competitive, employees, so to speak. So in other words, it will raise the level of competition in Botswana, and then the whole thing with trying to hire Zimbabweans or Malawians for less than the Botswanans, for example, will now create an environment for healthy competition. And at the end of the day, instead of deporting these guys, Botswana wins, Zimbabwe wins, because of the fact that now these illegal immigrants will now be legal in South Africa, in Botswana. But I don't know how that will work in South Africa anyway. But this is why we analyze these things. This is a solution Duma Boko is trying to implement in Botswana, as he's now the new president in Botswana. But this comment also now raises another interesting point. It says, many African immigrants are here to hustle instead of investing. They compete with our own low-income people for the informal economy, exacerbating our already high unemployment. And this is a really important point, because I remember growing up in Nigeria, we used to have a lot of illegal immigration, but this illegal immigration now was from Chad and Niger. I think those are the borders, those are the countries that kind of like are the neighboring countries to Nigeria. So most of those guys, we usually used to generally recognize them as Hausa speaking people anyway. But the borders, the border from northern Nigeria to these countries, Niger and Chad, I think there weren't really stringent checks at the time. And so I think even up till now though, but the Nigerian Immigration Service is really doing a good job and all of that. But there used to be a lot of inflow and influx of these, what we would call illegal foreigners in the terminology of South Africa, for example, flocking into Nigeria, all right? But for some reason, growing up in Nigeria, they seem not to really present so much of a threat in terms of the employment. The threat they really contributed was that we now notice in Nigeria that there was now an influx of weapons, all right? Illegal weapons, and the entrance from that region, Boko Haram and all of that, now started becoming an extremist threat to Nigeria, and then the increase of kidnapping in that region, and also now coming down to the south as well. So these were the threats that we got from illegal immigration. But in terms of the threats to the employment and capacity, because the Nigerian populace, especially at the south, so the cities like Lagos, the southern parts of Nigeria anyway, these people are really well educated, all right, and really have a high propensity for traveling. So many Nigerians are really known to travel out of their country. A lot of them have an adventurous mind, and they really understand the world, all right. So when most of these guys who actually now, like from this comment, it argues that most of these guys from Zimbabwe, Malawi, and all that, they compete on the low-income people, especially the informal economy. Nigeria really didn't have that problem of competition at the informal economy. And so at the end of the day, most of these guys who come in from Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso, had a safe landing in filling that space of the informal economy in Nigeria. So in Nigeria, for example, when we growing up, there was a terminology that was called aboki. I think it's a term in Hausa language that speaks of my friend. But we understood them as people who used to help people fetch water, and families would hire them, pay at some amount of money for them to fetch water from wells into their households. All right. So they really found jobs, so to speak, and they were really able to raise significant amounts of money to send back to their countries in Niger, in Chad, to take care of their families. All right, so there wasn't that competition with the informal economy. They found a safe landing, so to speak. It was, in fact, it almost felt like a timely entrance into the informal economy, and they really filled that gap really well. Many of them also worked as bike riders. So in Nigeria, there's this thing called an Okada. It's kind of like a bike transport, on the roads, So Nigerians really used to enjoy taking those bike rides on the road, and it formed a really interesting means of transportation. Before, I think at some point in Lagos, it was now taken away because it was now becoming a source of major accidents and people losing their lives. So illegal immigration in Nigeria, they didn't really threaten the unemployment status or employment trajectory of in Nigeria, so to speak. So there wasn't really that much of a threat. But in South Africa now, I begin to understand that why it could be a threat to have the Zimbabweans in South Africa, because for some reason, I think that during Robert Mugabe, and I think I found out this in a documentary, during Robert Mugabe's time, and also Ian Smith, sorry. of Rhodesia. So there was actually a really, well galvanized educational system in Zimbabwe that then erupted into the generation of really educated Zimbabweans, all right, who had their skills to offer, but not necessarily in a viable market in Zimbabwe. And so South Africa then became the alternative. And I think this is what Rutendo Martin Yarere speaks about a lot, that he came into South Africa to offer his services, really well-trained, intelligent. And a lot of Zimbabweans I meet across the world when I travel are really intelligent people, all right, but there isn't a favorable market. And so for them to now get into South Africa, it means that there would necessarily be a competition, a necessary threat to the South Africans. And knowing that the ANC, as we found out over the analysis on this channel with Palile Hotla arguing that there hasn't been training in terms of skills for the coloureds and the blacks, you see, so we can see that a skilled mass of Zimbabweans, for example, flocking into South Africa would necessarily become a threat to this group of people, and at the end of the day end up filling or taking in jobs that probably wouldn't have been, I don't know, for some reason been given to the South Africans or the because of the lack of skills. I don't know. I'm just trying to think out loud here, all right? But I hope we can engage in more robust conversations in the comments. But this is something I thought that was really interesting to point out between the Nigerian case and the South African case, the Nigerian experience with the South African experience with illegal immigration, all right? The kind of illegal immigration in Nigeria is one of, the informal economy that really wasn't a threat, I think, in my understanding. It's not, even up till now, it's not really a threat, because those guys coming from the northern parts of Nigeria aren't really a threat to the really educated and business-savvy Southerners, the likes of the Igbos and the likes of the Yorubas in Nigeria, right? So they found a safe landing in the informal economy in Nigeria. But in South Africa, I see that probably the influx of the well-skilled, well-trained, highly trained and skilled Zimbabweans coming into a South Africa that, then meets, an economy, for example, that is in need of skilled people, but probably they are also able to fill in those gaps, then becomes a source for this whole clash between what is now called illegal foreigners and then South Africans in terms of employment. So this is something that I think that is really important to really understand and help us in our analysis, so that we're able to paint a clear picture of what's really going on in South Africa. And also this comment now, the third point this person raises here, says that this one is the most important problem. She says, our supreme law, the Constitution, requires that every child has the right to be educated and to have access to health care. This applies to all people who live in South Africa, legal or illegal. So this is kind of like a compulsory education, all right, in South Africa. It's a law. Now, she says that the result of this law is that our schools and our healthcare facilities are overwhelmed. It is not uncommon to find long queues at our hospitals made up of foreigners only. Sometimes South African citizens cannot find beds in our public hospitals due to overcrowding by foreigners. Our public amenities are also overwhelmed. Pregnant mothers from neighboring countries cross into South Africa for prenatal medical care or give birth free of charge. This is a huge problem. Some South African businesses, such as restaurants, construction companies, and farms, also exploit this problem. They employ thousands of foreigners because they can pay them less than South Africans, who by law have to be paid a minimum wage. So, you see, this is a really complex problem, and I won't claim to have all the solutions, but I really love this comment. This is actually one of the best comments actually I've come across, because it's an education for me. This whole issue with compulsory education, and then having the fact that most of the people who have to be educated are now children of probably what would be called illegal foreigners. I think it's how, for me, I'm able to now interpret what happened to Chidinma, the Nigerian beauty pageant second runner-up, who then had to now go to Nigeria and was welcomed by Nigerians, all right? She argues, although I think I've seen many videos that have slowly started debunking that, she actually been saying that her family, actually both of them are Nigerians. But this whole case of the fact that the earlier argument, as analyzed by Leon Scriber, especially as he took office, and also Yetin Mackenzie as he took office as well, arguing that, I think she had Mozambican mother and a Nigerian father. But at the end of the day, because she was born in South Africa, this whole thing with the compulsory education now made her sort of like a victim, where she had to compulsorily partake of this law. But at the end of the day, in terms of trying to really represent South Africa, there were claws and flaws in her identity that now ended up, kicking her out and then having her head over to Nigeria for all of that. So these are really complex problems, and I think these are policies that the GNU should really now sit down and really slowly now break down and try to chop into pieces on how these things can be ratified. But I think first and foremost for me going forward would be the problem of the border. The problem of the border in South Africa. Something has to be done with those borders. At least if there can be a stop to we're not against foreigners in Africa, all right? The whole thing with Afrocentrism is about love for Africans, all right? Africans must love each other based on the law of Ubuntu. I am because we are, all right? In Europe, it's actually argued that the philosophical representation of the being was that I know, therefore I am. All right, so knowledge for the European is key. Then the Europeans. This is an argument in the articles now in academia. It says that the European established the basis of his identity based on the knowledge of who he is. All right, so I know because I am. But Ubuntu in African indigenous systems, so to speak, it's argued that the African sees their beingness in relation to the community. So I am because we are, so to speak, is the way the Africans can try to exhibit or express this communitarianist mindset that actually defines what an African is. We're not against that. We're really happy that Africans love each other, and hopefully the continent can really grow and function and become all it has to be. Africa has really gone through hell in the story of mankind, on the story of humanity. All right, Africa hasn't really expressed its excellence and its dominance the way it should be. But in terms of trying to really express this Afrocentrism and African excellence, let's avoid breaking down law. All right, because the moment we escape law, or the moment we denigrate law, then we invite chaos. So we shouldn't promulgate or promote illegality in the name of Afrocentricity. All right, law should still be key. So I wouldn't support, and I really don't think anybody in their right mind should support the existence of illegality, or what they call an illegal foreigner. The fact that there's that term illegal already even states that there's a law being broken. All right, but if that border can actually be addressed, the border issue in South Africa can be addressed, kind of like limits the possibility for people to enter into South Africa illegally. In Nigeria, they're doing it now. The Nigerian Immigration Service is actually topping its game in trying to really deploy more officers at those borders. I saw an article that actually argued that there are as much as 1,400 porosities in the borders where these guys from Niger, Chad actually get into Nigeria. All right, so border guards have been deployed into those areas, so it's kind of like improving anyway. But South Africa also has to kind of like take this move to secure the borders first. Then secondly, before solutions can actually be found in how to really identify who is illegal in South Africa and start addressing them. Otherwise, I think this whole clash between South Africans and foreigners, illegal foreigners especially, might continue unabated if something is not being done. And I hope that South Africans would also be careful not to kind of like pile up all foreigners into that one basket of illegal foreigners. But there has to be care in trying to identify that there are some foreigners in South Africa that live there legally and really want to contribute, but there's a cloud as well of illegal foreigners. Those ones are the ones who should actually be presented to kind of like these new policies to aid the extermination, or probably the end of illegal immigration in South Africa. So this is actually where we'll stop here. I don't want this video to be long, but I don't know, what do you think about Eddie's analysis here? Super. Well, share your thoughts. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments.